gave you high prices. They gave you the highest inflation in history, and we're bringing those prices down rapidly. Lower prices, bigger paychecks. You're getting lower prices, bigger paychecks. We're getting inflation. We're crushing it.
President Donald Trump claiming without evidence that prices are down across the country. The White House continues its effort to turn focus from the affordability crisis, with Trump referring to it as a Democratic con job. Polls show voter confidence in Trump's economic leadership has faltered as Americans struggle with the rising costs of food, housing, and utilities. Also last week, the Federal Reserve cut its key interest rate for the third time in a row. The board's vote was divided as the Fed tries to address both slowing job growth and rising inflation. President Trump, who frequently attacks Powell, is interviewing his replacement, said the cut just isn't enough. Professor Emeritus of Economics at DePaul University and instructor of economics at Western Washington University, Michael Miller, joins me this morning to talk more about all of this. Professor, nice to see you again, as always.
So, good morning, Paul.
Good morning. What is the impact of the tax cut? I mean, the markets go up as a result. Where is it felt? Mortgages coming down? Where does it hit?
Oh, in terms of the rate cut, it could be felt in mortgages because the mortgages would be tied to the 10-year Treasury rate. And the hope is, of course, that the cost of borrowing will fall. That will be true if the market decides that this action is not going to stimulate further inflation. If the market gets spooked and thinks that this is going to add to the inflation problem, rates will go the other direction in terms of the actual market. It doesn't matter what the Fed does.
And yet, Powell said he foresees likely another cut coming. So would you agree, as an economist, would you agree that, yeah, I would see one coming too? Or is he reacting to this ongoing pressure from the White House? He doesn't seem to care about what the White House says.
I hope he doesn't. I hope he's not being political. I would not judge whether they should or should not change the rates in the future until they see some data. One thing is that the Fed is kind of navigating in a world with no data. The only labor data we have is from the private sector. We have no official government data on labor, and we don't have any good, reliable data on inflation. So it's really hard if your two goals have to do with inflation and employment. How do you make a decision when you don't have the data? So I think he should have said, we're going to wait and see what we know when it comes time to make another decision.
He also made a comment about tariffs, kind of suggesting that the tariffs would have their one impact on the market and then things would settle in. I don't know, maybe that was just wishful thinking on his part. What is your reaction to it? And I'm thinking of the fact that the government is now going to be bailing out farmers, with the president saying, well, we can do that because we all have all this tariff money. But I think you as an economist would say, but the reason we have to bail them out is because of the tariffs.
Well, that's part of the reason when you're looking at but those are two separate things. The bailout of the farmers is a political action. But when it does come to tariffs and what we would call inflation, the tariff is pretty much like putting a tax on it. And once the tax is imposed, the tax does not continue to rise. So what Powell was talking about is that when the tax is imposed, the price of things will rise. About 75% of the tariff will be passed on to you and me in the form of higher prices. But then as we go along, even though new tax revenues being collected, the prices are not going up and up and up. And so he means that we'll have this one-time jump in the inflation rate, and then it'll stop. And any other inflation will be due to other matters, not because of the tariffs.
The inflation rate, the Fed always likes to keep it about 2%. President Trump likes to say it came in much higher than under Biden. And I've heard other economists sort of talk about the fact that it depends whether you're looking at an average number or the bottom line. And some economists are saying, look, it's pretty much the same now as it was under Biden's. And we are beyond the 2% desired rate that the Fed seeks.
And that's why there are several members on the board, including Goolsbee from the Chicago Fed, who voted to keep interest rates stable. Inflation did go way up to 9%, and it came down steadily to about 2.5%. And it's been bouncing between 2.5% and 3% for the past 2 years. And what the Fed can't seem to make that final push to make the inflation rate fall down to around 2%. And what Goolsbee's and other who are in favor of keeping rates high, the interest rate is the only tool that the Fed has to fight inflation. And so what you do is you keep the rate high just to slow down economic activity, which will slow down the ability of firms to raise prices, and that should, in the end, slow down the inflation closer to 2%.
A lot of discussion right now about a replacement for Jay Powell, even though his term is over at the end of May. But the president looks like and has said he's going to announce a replacement in the coming weeks. And he's made it pretty clear that he's looking for somebody who is akin to lowering rates even further. Maybe it's a smaller rate effects over time. Maybe it's some large ones. Is that a smart move to be looking for somebody who you're comfortable? And the truth is, isn't the Fed chair just one vote?
And the Fed chair is just one vote, but part of the job of the Fed is to try to whip everybody else into an agreement with what the chair sees as the future of the economy and in terms of interest rates. And the one guy who is at the top of the list, Kevin Hassett, I saw him interviewed extensively just this past week. And it was very clear to me, this man is, I believe, truthful, that he wants no politics whatsoever to be in the Fed decision. And he will decide whether interest rates should rise or fall based purely upon the economic data, the economic models they use to forecast the economy, and what would be best then to meet the dual mandate of the Fed. If Kevin Hassett is chosen, I think that would be a good replacement for Powell, who he's done some things which have been quite good, like getting us out of an inflationary period without pushing us into a recession. But at the same time, he's the guy who oversaw the rise of inflation to 9%. So I think a lot of people in various walks of business believe that Powell has not been the most effective person. And a strong person like Hassett, who wants to take politics out of the decision, would be, I think, a major improvement.
Less than a minute left. The president spoke in Pennsylvania last week with signs behind him that said lower prices, bigger paychecks. He says affordability is, he said it's not a hoax because prices were high, but it is a con job. Do people react to he's a very charismatic individual. Are they reacting to that, or are they reacting to what they feel in their pocketbook?
They're reacting to what they see in their pocketbook. And here's the one mistake. When you were playing those clips of Mr. Trump, like so many people, are confusing the idea of inflation with the idea of a price level. When you have inflation that goes up, prices go up. But once the inflation stops, the prices don't fall back down. The inflation stops. And what Mr. Trump keeps promising is a fall in prices. He can't bring that about.
It's a complex.
But it is true. Real wages since January of 2025 have increased. So people actually are taking home more money.
All right. Professor Mike Miller, thank you for your insight. We need more time. We'll talk again, I hope. But for now, enjoy your holidays.
Paul.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Enjoy it very much. Have
Professor
a great
Mike
holiday.
Miller. All right. Still to come on WGN TV Political Report. Senators reject 2 plans to stop a sharp rise in health care premiums. What could happen next on Capitol Hill? Stay with us.